Dominic Chappellet of Chappellet Winery. It is an absolute honor to have you here today on the Mr. Wine Guy podcast.
Thank you so much. I'm pleased to be here and I look forward to be answering some questions and we'll see where it goes.
Dominic, I have a couple of things I want to tell you. My podcast was very much active between 2018 and 2020, and then I took a little time off. And I felt the lack of getting to connect with so many people. So I decided to bring the podcast back. And one of the first people that I reached out to about having on the podcast was Alexa. And I
Wow.
remember I reached out to her and I thought, you know what, let me just take a shot. I reached out to her and she connected me, rightfully so, with the PR team. And then they eventually connected us. And so one of the first things I want to tell you right out of the gate is this has been about a year now when I think about wanting to bring the podcast back. Having you on the show, you were always like your brand, your family was always one of the first people I had in my mind to bring back on the show, if you will. And so I wanted to go ahead and let you know how special it is and how important it is to me to have you here. But I also want to take this opportunity to really focus in on you and your family. To me, and for the people that are listening, a lot of people are probably very much aware of Chappellet with so many decades and so much history in the wine industry. And there may be people that listen today that aren't really familiar with Chappellet, and hopefully we can introduce that to those people. But when I think of Chappellet, Dominic, I think of wine. I think of the industry. I think that Chappellet is a definition of blueprint to the wine industry. When you think of Pritchard Hill, a lot of people talk about Pritchard Hill. They talk about how Pritchard Hill is so great, and it is. And there's so much distinction to the soils and to the microclimate and all that. Chappellet is Pritchard Hill. Literally, you are the body of Pritchard Hill.
I say that quite often, so I'm glad you're saying it too.
Man, I'm telling you. So today I want to take the opportunity to share about the legacy of Chappellet and to let everybody know just how important it is. You are one of the Mount Rushmores to the wine industry. And I do not take it lightly, Dominic. You are a huge inspiration to me. You are a man of wisdom. You're a man of business. You are a leader in the industry in so many different facets. So with those things being said, it's an honor to have you here today.
That's a buildup. That's a buildup and a half. So let's see if we can live up to any of that. I can tell you that what you said about Pritchard Hill is very true. Not only is Chappellet Pritchard Hill, that's what we think of it as, but Pritchard Hill really is part of each of us. Each of my family members is so in love with this place. You also said that when you think about wine, you think of Chappellet, and that's great. I love that. The funny thing is that when I think of Pritchard Hill, I think of something so much beyond the wine is the thing that allows it to happen. The vineyards are the thing that make us possible to be up here. But being stewards of this larger piece of property is in many ways the greater goal.
Yeah.
That might sound odd to some people, but in truth, having lived here, grown up here, while it was my father's dream to create wines that would rival the great wines of the world and be able to be placed on the same table with those wonderful wines that he collected as a young man. My experience up here was growing up on this amazing piece of property.
Dominic, you talk about your father, Don, and I'm going to talk a lot about your family today. And this is a second generation winery. So Chappellet goes all the way back to 1967 when you broke ground. And we're referring to your father, Don. By the way, for those that are listening, Don has passed away since 2016. And so I want to make sure that everybody's aware of when I speak about Don, I'm speaking about the legacy that he left. And also your mother, Molly. I want to talk about your mother, Molly, and just so many different ways that she's been such a huge contribution to the legacy as well. But I want to start with talking about your father, Don. You come from a very strong entrepreneurial background. So when you think about your family, it goes all the way back to days of mining for gold, days of oil. And then when you think about your father, I thought it was cool. I actually read that your father invented the prototype for a product back then that would actually dispense coffee. So basically, like it ground the coffee. And so today, when I think about, like, I went to a car dealer or something and I wanted a cup of coffee while I was waiting, that's because of Don Chappellet. So I want you, if you could, talk about your father, his entrepreneurial spirit, and then what inspired him to take that same entrepreneurial spirit and start a winery in the late 60s in Napa Valley.
As you might imagine, I tell this story in various forms quite often, But I'll have to say that every time I tell it, I'm a little bit um, at a loss for words. I'm a little sort of stunned as to what he did and how he did it. You talked about the coffee business, and so I'll start there. Being a young entrepreneur, young college student, just getting out of college, my dad and his best friend decided they wanted to go into business. They didn't know what it was going to be, but there are these young guys. Interestingly, my grandfather was part of a large company that absolutely did not allow any nepotism. So there was no chance of my dad ever getting hired from his dad. So he knew that he was going to have to do something on his own.
Yeah.
Coffee business came along because as looking for some opportunity, he and his best friend, my dad and his best friend, were just trying to find something to invest money in that they could turn around. And that money was a very small amount. They had both borrowed at that time, which I'm sure seemed like a lot of money. They had both convinced their fathers that when they had this opportunity that they'd be able to pay them back if their fathers lent them both $1,000. So they bought this machine that a man had reconfigured. It was an old vending machine. The vending machines for coffee at that time, back in the early 50s, looked like regular vending machines. That's all fine. And they did produce coffee into a cup. The issue was that coffee came from a vat of coffee that got replaced like once a week.
Yeah.
So it was just this warmed up, nasty swill that you got in a cup. And it's what you got. The guy that they bought this patent from, who had been working as an inventor, trying to say, could he improve this thing, figured out a way to have this coffee machine brew coffee fresh with fresh grounds and hot water into each individual cup. It was a big change because people got to have actually fresh, much better coffee than they could have gotten before. It changed the industry. It changed their lives. They were these young guys who hit on something that worked. And over the course of 10 or 12 years, they built this tiny company into something pretty big. Along the way, my dad was collecting wine. He was tasting coffee in the morning and tasting wine in the evening. And in his early 20s, it must have been when he was like 22, he started collecting bottles and learning a little bit about wine. By the time he was around 30, his company had gotten quite a bit bigger, and they had an opportunity to go public. They went public. That was all great. But the funny thing that happens to a lot of entrepreneurs when their businesses go public is they realize it's not theirs anymore.
Yeah.
That entrepreneurial thing has just died, and now you're just working for your investors. And while that could be wonderful, for my dad and his buddy, it wasn't wonderful. It was like, this was our baby, and now it's not anymore, and it's lost its luster. But the thing that didn't lose its luster for my dad was his wine collection that was growing and growing. And so when my mom saw this in him, that he was coming home from work dejected and not happy, they started having conversations like, we're still young. Maybe we should do something else. Maybe you've got a great opportunity. This business was really successful. But the part I get lost on is where you take that love of a hobby, of something that's fun to do, and decide to, after having, made it, right? You've got a
Right.
beautiful home. You've got 5 kids. The business is doing well. What if we just sold everything, put everything we have into a venture we have no idea how to do,
Mhm.
and take all our 5 kids along and see if we can make it work? I personally have a hard time making that leap. I'm a father. I know what it means to have security and comfort for my kids and feel like that's taken care of. To gamble all of that because there was a passion behind it, because my mom saw in my dad that he wasn't happy, and to go after something that you're excited about in life and really put all your eggs in one basket. That's brave. It's a big move. And look behind me, I've got this oversized poster, but this is what they found. And this is the place that excited them and turned into something that we are so proud of.
Dominic, you speak of your father's willing to take a risk. And when you think about entrepreneurship, there's people that are out here that are listening, or there's people in general that are entrepreneurs that may look at a risk and say, yeah, you know what, that is something I had to do. But to think of the magnitude that your father and your mother collectively came,
Yeah.
and when you think about too, Dominic, when you think about wanting to be happy, feeling young, feeling like they had so much more to offer, seeing at that moment where they could break away and do something else, but knowing there was a risk involved. I really think that like when people are listening, they have to understand that to be truly successful in anything, I think taking risks is important, but I think your father, Don, deserves such a credit and such a testament to the fact that he didn't just take a risk. Like he put everything on the line just to go after his passion, which he had ultimately found in first growth Bordeaux.
It's impressive and inspiring to me. I've got one of my sons is somebody who I can see doing something like that. He's an entrepreneur to his core.
Yeah.
So I can see him taking that route. It's not in all of us. I don't know that I would do it. I think I probably would have said, you know what, this is great. I've done it and I'm going to make this work and I'm going to find other way to make myself happy. But I'm so in awe of that big move that they've made. And that it wasn't just about going and making wine. It was saying, if I'm going to do this, I don't want to just make wine. I want to make great wine. And to have in your mind that you, as this young guy in California, could possibly go and make wines that would be standing, as I said, with these great wines that he was collecting. And he had wines in his cellar that are talked about to this day in the wine world as the greatest wines, the greatest vintages from the greatest places in the world. 29 Margaux, 45 Mouton, 61 Latour. I can go down the list of these wines that people see as unicorn wines that he had in his cellar. And these are the wines that inspired him, that he said, okay, I don't want to make any wine. I want to make a wine where I can put my wine next to this wine and have people say, oh yeah, that's surprising. Oh, that might actually outshine that.
Mhm.
One Latour or whatever it is.
You know what, Dominic, you speak of unicorn wines, and here in a little bit, I do want to talk about a unicorn wine that you guys produced back in 1969. When I
Yeah.
think about like unicorn wines, like you said, I think of the 69 Chappellet, but I want to talk real quick about your mother. We have your father, and your father is this incredible business guy. He's this entrepreneur. He's this like inventor, if you will. And then you have your mother. She's in fact leading the whole way in her own realm. So she's a designer. She's a lover of architecture. She is an author, so she's wrote books that have been awarded by James Beard. And then also she has one of the most beautiful gardens. It's been recognized as one of the most beautiful gardens. I'm wondering too, is that something that has to do with the backdrop on the wall there?
Yeah, this is from the base of her garden looking out onto the vineyard. So there's a little smattering of her garden.
Wow.
The first book that she wrote was called A Vineyard Garden, which really encapsulate what it was that she walked into or what she created up here. Everywhere we look on this property these days, you see the touch
Mhm.
of my mom. And she came here really to support and be part of this new venture with her husband. But I don't know that she really knew what she was walking into. This was a life very different from the life that she grew up in. And while she spent some time summers going to, um, friends' places that were ranches or whatever from time to time, so she had some country experience. She lived in Los Angeles and Beverly Hills area. She grew up down there, went to Beverly Hills High as a kid. So coming out here is very different. You weren't walking to the store. You weren't driving 5 minutes to go anywhere. It's a half an hour to get to town. The, the, the vegetables in the grocery store were wilty and awful back then. There was no place to get that. She realized, okay, quickly she had to plant a vegetable garden. Um, but she took on every aspect of this place. And look, she's 93 this year
Wow.
and is still cracking the whip, wants to be involved in every decision that happens on the property, wants to know what's going on with the business on every day. When I'm up here, I go by and see her just about every day and check in with her. And she's always saying, what's happening today? What happened up at the winery? Did you see our vineyard manager, Andrew? Did you talk to him about what's going on with this little section of vines? She's, she is involved in every way.
Wow.
And interestingly, in those early years, especially, I think where she felt that she could be of the most help was to promote the winery by doing things like having people over for lunch, inviting chefs over, some pretty big name chefs that have made their way up to the house over the years. And
Julia Child's one of them.
Julia Childs was somebody who I have met a few times in my youth because she came up and had lunch. But realizing that my dad wanted to focus on the winery, making the wines and being there. And she was like, we need to show people that we're here. We need to entertain and pour these wines for people. And She knew instinctively that was part of it. So the gardens played into that. Her love of art in general. You look around the way that she has expressed this property in her hull by
Yeah.
taking the outside and bringing it in, whether that's a gnarled old branch that's beautiful or a piece of moss that goes down the center of the table. She's seen things in this property, has opened all of our eyes to a way of looking at art in the world that goes well beyond maybe what our initial thoughts of that are. She sees the world in many ways as art. I can't
Right.
tell you how many times when growing up, my mom would say, "Wait, look," as we're driving along the Silver Rock Trail. "I want you to look out there right now. The light's never going to be the same." Uh,
Wow.
and that's how she has approached every day of her life. She just always sees things in a way that is unique and sees the beauty and form of things in a very special way.
Wow, Dominic, like when I hear you say that, it reminds me of a woman that's in the moment. When I think about, strangely enough, I was reminded of, have you ever seen videos of something that's happening that's special and everybody has their phone out and
Yeah,
everybody's recording it? And then what will people say in the comments? Not a phone in sight, right? Because they're making fun of the fact that nobody's taking in that moment. But I feel like your mom is the one in the crowd that doesn't have her phone out. She's
yeah,
truly taking everything in the moment. And I think I think that's a testament to her. Your mom is an absolutely beautiful human being. And I love how she's still cracking that whip, like you said, like she's still very much involved, very much interested. And she's
yeah.
not doing it because she feels like she has to. I truly believe she really wants to continue to be that involved because this is her legacy.
Yeah. No, there's no doubt. It's because she loves it. She feels it. She's passionate about it. Again, like I started saying, that's the property itself is inspiring to her, to all of us. And she holds on to that every day. I can't tell you how often she gives me a call and says, do you have your camera out right now? You
Yeah.
need to go out there. The clouds. Did you see the clouds?
Yeah, that's
I don't have
amazing.
my camera on me right now. She said, well, go get it.
Wow, that's amazing. I do want to talk a little bit about the property and how that correlates to her love and her passion here in a second, but I want to get into the groundbreaking of Chappellet. And strangely enough, I'm going to take this back to Prohibition. So Prohibition was 1920 to 1933. This was a constitutional ban on the sale and distribution of alcohol. And when I think about Chappellet, Chappellet was the second established winery since the end of Prohibition. So we're talking 1933 to 1967. I feel surprised about that. I feel, was there like this hesitance in the world of distribution to get rolling and get back into the distribution of making alcohol? Or do you think that it just happened the way that it was supposed to? Because being the second established winery since Prohibition, look at all the time that passed. I found that a little strange, or do you think that just worked out the way it was supposed to?
Yeah, I don't know how that comes about as far as timing. As far as we're concerned, it was definitely a very different time. People were not moving to the Napa Valley to go
Right.
start wines. So I think just as an industry, there was a stasis for a long time. It was what it was. The wines from France were the wines from France. Those names hadn't changed forever. The wines from America were the wines from America. You had your 32 wineries in the Napa Valley.
Yeah.
That was it. There just wasn't a lot of growth in the industry. And I don't think there certainly wasn't an understanding like there is now of wine and wine the world over.
Mhm.
And to make no mistake, there's no understanding of Napa Valley. Nobody could worldwide, nobody really cared about Napa Valley or what they were doing. I have to give props to Robert Mondavi. There's the reason Napa Valley in many ways is what it is because he was a relentless promoter of Napa Valley, well beyond Mondavi. He rarely talked about Mondavi first. He would always talk about Napa Valley. He was that first winery to start up since Prohibition. We were the second ones.
Yeah.
His was in 66, ours 67. We got our winery built in 68. The community itself was very welcoming to our family. And also, I'm sure quite curious because, again, this wasn't normal. People
Yeah.
weren't coming up to do this. Whereas today, there's 1,000 brick and mortar wineries that have established since then in
Mm.
Napa Valley. And it seems like everybody who wants to make a little wine and has a bunch of extra money can come up here and do that. It was a very different time. So that's all I can think about. I don't know about that big chunk of time between
Right.
33 and 67 where nobody was, doing anything new with wine. But boy, did it change after that time. And it took about 10 years before we started really seeing some momentum. Obviously, the Judgment in Paris in 76 changed things around the world
Drastically.
as
Yeah.
people looking at Napa Valley. But we were at the forefront of that. And certainly Hillside, nobody was doing that because who wanted to be way out of the valley and dealing with all the stuff that we have to deal with, rocks and not much water and far away from the infrastructure in the valley.
Yeah.
That just seemed like a pain. You can make perfectly good grapes down there on the flats.
You know what's funny, Dominic, is it reminds me of the testament to your father and your mother, just having that willingness to take the risk. And then also, you mentioned how the community was so welcoming. And then you said something about, in general, 1,000 wineries have been built up since then. You were like the first 3-minute mile runner. So when you think about somebody that like runs a 3-minute mile, all of a sudden people start running the 3-minute mile because they realize they can because the one person did it. And I think that was
Yeah,
your
the dam
family.
broke.
Yeah, I think that was your family. And so I think
Yeah.
that's a testament to your family and your willingness. And when you look at them breaking ground in Pritchard Hill, there was a little bit of an inspiration from another gentleman that you didn't mention, Andre Telechev. And he had a
Yeah.
little bit of persuasion. So when you think about some icons like Robert Mondavi, you have Andre Telechev, and then you guys, of course. But what back then, how did your family have a relationship with Andre? And also, what did Andre know about Pritchard Hill that he felt like he could really influence your family to break that ground up there?
I don't know where the introduction came first off with Andre. I know that my dad had been collecting Beaulieu Vineyards wines, which
Mhm.
were made by Andre in the 50s, 60s, and into the 70s. And he had a lot of respect for him and knew of Andre Chelchev through writings and articles. I don't know how it happened. I do know that they eventually met and got to taste wine together a number of times during the time that my father was looking for vineyards in Napa Valley. And he was just
Right.
researching, like, how do I do this thing? How do I make the best wine in the world? What's going to happen? This is as close as I can come. This guy's making incredible wines. He's hugely regarded in the industry. So he tasted with it and they talked. And after a few of these tastings, and first of all, it was a funny combo because Andre Chelchev was 5'6" or something. He's a short guy, a little Russian dude who smoked heavily. My dad was 6'4", never smoked a cigarette in his life, but they both loved wine and they bonded on that. Andre had a huge personality, was out there doing his thing. My dad was quiet, calm, and soft spoken.
Much, yeah.
So they're opposites, but they had a very clear love of wine. And when Andre talked to him about where he sourced his fruit, he said, Don, I get almost all of my grapes from the valley floor. And I think I make some pretty good wine.
Mhm.
Uh, but there's a couple hillside vineyards. There's not a lot in the valley, but the grapes I get from there, I think that they enhance the wines that I make. I feel like I could make better wines if I could get more hillside fruit in my wine.
Wow.
So really that was it. It was less about specifically Pritchard Hill, was saying the hillsides in Napa Valley are an untapped resource for quality. And was when my dad heard Andre say I could make better wine if I could get more grapes from the hillsides, that there was no question for, okay, then hillside vineyards, that's what I'm looking for.
Mhm.
He talked to a local real estate agent. The local real estate agent said, yeah, okay, but do you really want to do that, Don? I can probably show you a couple, but I don't think you want to do that. And he took him up here to Pritchard Hill, the first property, and then looked at, it was owned by a man named, last name Harton. He had planted some grapes up here, didn't really know what he was doing, but luckily he planted a little core of Cabernet. So my dad liked that.
Yeah.
The thing behind me, this is what they looked out on. And
Wow.
there weren't as many vines out there when they looked at this, but it was stunning and hard to get out of your head. And that it had that other property that Andre had talked about. It was in the hillside and it was in Napa Valley. So I think they looked at a few other hillside properties, but they couldn't get this one out of their head. And they said, this is where we're going to be. And probably some of that had to do with the fact that there was a ranch house that this guy had built that had enough bedrooms that most of her kids could have a room of their own. A couple of them were going to have to share, but at least it had a starter place to be. And that's the hope we all grew up in. Uh,
That's awesome, Dominic. When I think about another testament or just another compliment to your father was seeking mentorship from the best. I feel like your father, if I had to think for him or speak for him, I think he was probably looking at who are the best people that are doing this, and I'm going to trust them with everything. No real estate agent was going to sway your father when it came to something that a mentor in his mind, like Andre Telechev, was going to encourage your father to do. And so I think that says a lot about your father. And when I think about the wineries, it's interesting. You're like the first vintage, if you will. So you were born, I think, the year that the winery was built,
Yeah,
and the ground
68.
was broke in 67. So you're like first vintage as well. But when you
Right.
think about the winery, going back to your mother, Molly, the winery is a true testament to your mother. And there's so much about the winery that I would love to hear from you and share. This was actually built, or I'm sorry, designed by an architect named Ed Moses. And it's meant to replicate like ancient pyramids. And it has a beautiful view from an aerial perspective as well. But I want to compliment your mom too, because she had a lot to do with the influence and the inspiration, being a woman of design and a woman that's so in tune and especially like you've mentioned already, just sharing in the moment, seeing things in the moment. So talk a little bit about your winery and just the inspiration to build it the way that you guys did.
Okay, first of all, you mentioned the above. So this is what you would see if you look directly down on our winery from Google Earth. So that's where our little symbol comes from.
Yeah.
So it's triangular shape or pyramidal shape, if you want to put it that way. Really, in that first year or so, looking at it, they wanted to build a winery that would answer all the questions that a winery needed to answer. It needed to have enough space. It needed to be able to be cooled. But all of that, all the technical stuff was less important for my mom than not having a terrible building that we had to look at for the next 50 or 100 years or however long we were going to be here.
Yeah.
She kept saying, we can't just build a warehouse in the middle of this beautiful place. We have to build something that fits in and with the surrounding. And my mom, I don't know if I mentioned, but she was heavily involved in the art scene in Los Angeles when they lived down there. She went to school as an art minor, English major art minor. Art's always been part of her life, but she got to know a lot of the young artists in Los Angeles because she was a docent at the LA County Museum.
Oh,
So
wow.
she's one of the ones who would tour you around and tell you about what was on the walls and what exhibition was coming. And so she got to meet a bunch of these artists who were displaying in galleries around Los Angeles area and become friends with this young group of artists. One of those happened to be a guy named Ed Moses. So when looking for a design for this new building, she kept calling and writing letters to her artist friends down there saying, this is what we're doing and we're trying to make this happen. But I've got to come up with a great design or my husband's just going to put a warehouse up in the middle of this thing. Give me something. And really after about a year of not having a building, my dad was like, we got to put something up now. And harvest is coming. We got to do this. We bought this piece of property. And this guy, Ed Moses, who's an artist, actually did a little napkin sketch, sent it off to my mom and said, what do you think of this? She said, oh, well, that could be really great. Can we see a model? So they actually did take it out to an architect to build a model.
Oh, wow.
But beyond that, my dad said, this is amazing. And it looks like it'll work. It'll give us all the floor space we need and everything. Boy, there's a lot of technical stuff that how are we going to build this? And until you come up here, it doesn't really compute as far as what an engineering feat this place was. So I'm going to have to encourage everybody who's watching this to come see what I'm talking about. But ultimately, my dad looked at this thing and said, we don't need an architect. We need an engineer. And I understand the plans. This is great, but we need somebody who can make this happen. We skipped the architect process other than to say that he built this guy that they went to built a model. And my dad went immediately to the yellow pages, if anybody knows what those are anymore. But it's a photo book where the pages are yellow and all of the crafts, all of the businesses
Right.
advertised in there. He went to the yellow pages, start flipping through, looking for engineers. They found an engineer firm in Santa Rosa and contacted a man named Dick Keith. And they had a few conversations on the phone. My dad asked if he'd ever built a winery. He said, no, but I'd love to. And he hired this guy and they became good friends and they built the winery. Dick Keith, after that, went on to build over 200 wineries in Napa and Sonoma over the
Oh,
years
wow.
and be involved in the engineering of those. So it worked out well for him, worked out well for us. But It is a stunning building, and also it does blend in with the surroundings. The
Yeah.
outside is rusted metal. It's that pyramidal shape, so it looks like a little pointy hill, a little rusty pointy hill. But it doesn't feel like it's encroaching on this beautiful area. It feels like it's really, if anything was meant to be there, that's what it was. The One of the interesting things is that when you see it from the outside, it's beautiful, it's stunning, but then you walk in the doors, then you walk in and somehow it seems to get bigger.
Yeah.
The inside feels bigger than the outside. And there's some little tricks that happen that make that the case, but it is pretty interesting when you do that. And the huge vaulted ceilings, we've got 60-foot long beams that are holding this thing up. So again, it's been described as a cathedral to wine, and it does feel that way at times. There's beautiful light in there, an incredible design. All of that being said, there was a lot of things a lot of questions we didn't know to ask early on. We ended up building a second winery right next to it to answer those questions. But that original building is still in use today. Still very much, it represents what we do. There's no doubt.
Yeah, Dominic, when you mentioned the landscape, it does fit with the landscape. And I like how you mentioned your mom didn't want this box on a hill, basically. She wanted something that was going to fit with the surroundings, and a true testament to your mom. Before we get into your, I guess, your journey before you came back to Pritchard Hill, so you went to school, and I want to talk a little bit about that. You were involved in a lot of blending trials when you were really young. And I have a question about this because I think this is like has a lot to do with you as an entrepreneur. So when you think about blending trials, there's a lot of little details that are being maneuvered and changed in order to make something better, something that's already good. And you're making it better because you see a flaw or you see a way that you can change that. And I know you've done that throughout your career. But as a young kid, and I'm almost envious when I think about, I paint these mental pictures of seeing you being in the presence of all these incredible people, tasting these wines or getting to experience what it's like to change these blends around. What do you think, fast forward even to today? What do you think those little details of making a change, making an adjustment, seeing something that's great and making it better have really been influential or made an impact on your career or on your legacy that you've created? Say, for example, as Chappellet, you're doing it amazing. You're doing it at 99%, if you will, 100%, but you're always trying to find ways to maneuver. Do you think that those experiences that you had in those blending trials had a lot to do with you kind of being a better entrepreneur as you got older?
That's an interesting notion. What I would say about my early tasting, let's just start there with
Yeah.
my parents. First of all, they didn't have wine at dinner every night, but when there was a special occasion or maybe even a new bottling that my dad wanted to taste or something, a bottle would come out on the table. And anytime that would happen when we were all sitting there, it was certainly encouraged for all of us to try the wine. As a young kid, I didn't get my own glass, rarely, but the glass would get slid over to me. Tell me what you think of this, right?
Yeah.
And so I'd sit there and I'd smell the wine and I'd taste it. And best thing that we can learn from our kids or from any kids is their ability to speak without a filter.
Mm,
Right. So
totally.
I'd just tell them what I'm tasting, what I was thinking, and just be honest about it. I was like, oh, I don't know, tastes like a tin pie pan. Or so that's that metallic taste that you sometimes get.
Yeah.
Sometimes people call that even bloody or whatever. Oh, it's really my mouth puckers. It's all watery. This just what's happening in your mouth. So I was encouraged. Oh yeah, you're absolutely right. And then we talk about it. Okay, what does that mean? Where's that coming from? What are you trying to describe? I was almost certainly a better taster and a better descriptor at 10 than I am today, because now I've been influenced by all of life and all of what I think something should be and what I think I should be tasting and
You're
whatever. None
jaded.
of that there back then. Being part of that from that age on, and then later when I was dipping my toe into working for the winery and coming back and working a harvest or helping out on the road or being home and being able to be part of some blending trials with the winemaking team, those, just being honest, our winemaking team, that's the team making the wine. As family members, sure, my dad was very involved in all the early blending early on. When he started off, it was just my dad and the winemaker and maybe one assistant helping out, deciding on what the blend was going to be. These days, we've got a group of about 5 or 6 people in the winery who are tasting, blending, uh, dealing with that just about every day, certainly during harvest every day. And so when I am involved with those these days, I have my input, I write down my scores, I write down my comments, I'm working with the guys, but their level of understanding, taking those grapes and from out in the vineyard and walking through the whole process of what that wine is doing from the second it gets, squished into juice till
Yeah.
it gets into the bottle and what barrels they're in, what lots are being blended together. It is humbling to be in that group of people and giving your opinion when that's happening. Now, having said that, we're very clear the type of wine we're trying to make. Our winemaker, Philip, has been with us on this round since 1990. He
Yeah.
worked under Kathy Corison starting in 1980 for a few years and then went off to do his thing because he figured Kathy would never be leaving. But by 1990, he came on and he's been with us ever since. If that crew at this point doesn't know the type of wine we're trying to make, then I guess we're in trouble.
Yeah.
So I guess what I'm saying is, while I've enjoyed being part of those, I cannot take credit for making these big decisions. This is a team of people who lives this every day. And sure, I will give my opinion when these things happen. And I love being part of those tastings and I still do it, but I'm not there every day with this. I'm not
Mhm.
living this in the way that they do. Our strength of our teams up here, I think you'd be hard pressed to find a vineyard and winery team that has the longevity on one piece of property and the knowledge of one piece of property that we do here. Now, maybe there's some around the world like that, but I think in Napa Valley, we've got a vineyard foreman who's been with us 53 years.
Wow.
Our winemaker, Philip, since 1990, or I guess officially his title now is VP of winemaking. But our winemaker Rye, under him,
Mhm.
he's only been with us for 17 years. We've got other employees who have been with us for 40 years, 35 years. Their understanding, their knowledge of the wine and the property um, is also what allows us to keep getting better. And you touched on that early on. How do you keep working towards doing something better? First of all, it comes from knowledge. It comes from an understanding of what you're working with. And then being willing as a family and owner to say, okay, when the vineyard manager says, we'd like to change row direction in this area, which means ripping out vines and starting over in this block or this area, that's a big expense.
Yeah.
But you're going to make it better? Yes. Okay, do it. When the same for the cellar, gosh, we could really use some more gentle pumps or an optical sorter or new tanks or whatever. And the question is, are the other ones not working? No, they're working. Why are we doing this? It's going to make the wine better. Okay. The answer is yes.
Yeah.
So every time we have an opportunity to work towards doing something a little better, our answer as owners is, okay, I guess that's where we're going to invest. And the investment for us is always back into the property and back into the winery. It's not like there's some overflowing cash reserves that are constantly going out to the family. And this is a labor of monetary love. This is trying to do something beautiful and meaningful that expresses this land. And which means that you're constantly investing in it. Everything that you make is going back into this place.
I love how you are so willing to invest in what I'm hearing is your legacy. Like you want to make sure that your wines stay at the tier at the top that they have been for all of these decades. And so I think that's a testament to you. I also think it's a testament to you of your willingness or your love, your ability to trust your team. And you rely on your team. You don't just let your team tell you what they think, but you just make the decision and humor them. Like you're very much about your team. And so I think that says a lot about you. And I love the longevity of your team when you talk about Rye and he's been the winemaker for only 17 years. So I don't know if you listen to Metallica, but I love Metallica. And Robert Trujillo is the bass player. And people joke and say he's still the new guy, but he's been with the band for 20 years. But when you think about Metallica from back in the 80s thrashing, he's still the new guy. But that's something that comes to my mind when you talk about Rye. But
Yeah.
looking at your time before you came back, to Pritchard Hill in the late 90s, 99, I believe. You went on to study in television, digital design, if you will. What inspired you to do that? And also what inspired you to come back home?
I had been living in Big Sur. I'd done a number of different things after high school and doing some junior college here and there. I helped a friend open a restaurant, done a bunch of things, worked at a bunch of restaurants, ended up moving to Big Sur and thinking that I'd be there for a summer learning how to operate heavy equipment because I needed a summer job. I got humbled by the guy I was working for and the crew there in that summer and ended up staying 8 years to finally learn how to operate a shovel before I could operate a piece of equipment. But basically worked with some people I really, really admired and learned a lot about what it is to do hard work down there. And then during that time, met my first wife and we were about to have a child. And that made me look at what my options were in life and where I was. I had built a little house in Big Sur. I was, doing well, but I thought maybe I need to reevaluate. I've got a child now. And so I went back to school because I had been away from school for a while and I had basically didn't even know it. I missed this whole digital computer evolution. I hadn't been on a computer for 8 years. I didn't know. So I went to trying to catch up with the world after having lived in Big Sur for 8 or 10 years and took this route of television studio engineering. It was just something that was interesting to me. And it allowed me to catch up and learn how to write a Word document and log on to a computer and all this stuff. And eventually I learned through this schooling, learn how to network. And strangely enough, that led into my taking on a couple of projects. I had come back up onto the property for, again, thinking I'd be there for a summer up here. And there was a little cabin I was living in with my wife and now my newborn child. And there were a lot of things that they needed up at the winery. They needed to network all the computers. I was like, I can do that.
Yeah.
So I found myself getting work back at home, not in a very arena of making wine or selling wine or anything, but just some technical stuff that needed to be done. And then as I was around, I was like, oh, and there's an event this weekend. Would you mind helping us out with that? So I was like, oh, sure. I'm here. I'll help out with the event.
Yeah.
Then maybe a few weeks later, it's, oh gosh, we don't have anybody to go and meet with our distributors in Texas. Would you go down, just take a quick trip down there? We've got launching this year's new Shannon or whatever it was. I forget what it was, but some reason somebody needed to go to Texas. And so I get sent off doing that. These things kept coming my way as I was doing other stuff. And then I realized, oh, I've been here for about a year and I kept doing more things for the winery. And then they needed a garden to be managed on the property for the employees. I say, I got some time, I'll do that. And then at some point it dawned on me, oh, I'm working for the winery. I'm doing all sorts of things, but I'm basically working for the winery. Maybe I should negotiate for some pay.
Yeah.
Because I wasn't really getting paid. I wasn't getting paid for it. So it was a very organic process. I didn't plan on coming back, but it was very natural. I don't know. I guess at some point in my life, I realized that I wanted to know every time I went into a restaurant if our wine was on the menu.
Yeah.
And if it was, I'd look through the wine list. And, oh, okay. Well, can I speak to your manager or your wine buyer? And I'd thank them for having those. And this is when I wasn't involved in the winery, be a 20, 21-year-old kid menu. But that was always part of it. And then when it wasn't, I was like, oh, I noticed you don't have any Chappellet. Are you familiar with this Chappellet? So I'm doing the thing out there just naturally and not really realizing it. This was in my bones. It was in my blood. This was part of my life. And then making it officially part of my life by being back on the property at the right time. Again, this organic process. And then I realized, oh, I'm back here. So it's been not a direct route at all for me and my, rise or ascension through the ranks. Really, it started from the very bottom, from doing a little networking in the winery, managing a garden. I did work harvest prior to moving back here when my daughter was born, just because, again, I needed a job and I wanted to know what it was like to work as a cellar intern. They hired me, which was nice of them. And I got some credit with the cellar guys. Our winemaker, Rye, now, he knows that I know what's going on in the winery from a winemaking standpoint. I get a little nod of respect for having taken the time to do that. I worked in the tasting room because I wanted to know how the sales were going, how people were interacting with our customers. And when I initially started working back up here, I said, I'd really like to get on the schedule a couple days a week doing tours and tastings. So I just put myself in the thick of it and started doing what was asked of me and doing a little more every once in a while. How that stuff like I was asking myself. Um, so that's how I got to where I am. There was no plan. It wasn't some secret. I did what was needed to be done in front of me. And again, because of having grown up in this and understood the business just from being around it in my life, it has evolved into what it is now. I'm now COO, so I got a big old title. But ultimately, I'm just doing the same thing. I'm doing what's asked of me. When I see a piece of trash on the road, I pick it up. Or if a toilet's clogged in the bathroom in the winery, if I'm the one there to fix it, I'm the one there to fix it. That's what you do, I think, as an owner. We certainly ask all of our employees when I interview a new employee. I try to interview just about everybody who comes to work for us. One of the things I say is, there's no job that I won't do, and I expect that from all of my employees.
Yeah.
I say my employees, they're our employees. We're all working together. But ultimately, the first thing that can get you a ticket out of here is to say, "Oh, that's not my job description." Like,
Oh, I hate that.
sorry,
It's the worst.
sorry,
I'll be 42.
have a job description somewhere else.
I'll be 42 in July, and I cannot stand hearing that. That's not my job description. I actually was going to tell you, I would feel weird if I was the winemaker asking you to go move some barrels or something, because in the back of my mind, I'm like, this is Dominic. I'm like, I don't feel like I should be asking him, but that's cool that you took on that responsibility. I also like, Dominic, how there's like, you are truly like, there's no job in the winery that you wouldn't do. And you expect that from everybody.
Yeah, we're all coming to work. We should enjoy it. We should also realize I'm sorry, but there's shit that's no fun.
Yeah.
It'd have to be done too.
Yeah.
And it's such a better place to work when everybody's realizing that and they're helping each other out instead of saying, "Well, that's not my job."
Yeah.
That's the kiss of death for me. It's, what do you mean that's not your job?
That's the
The
worst.
the thing that's in front of you.
Yeah. I can't stand. Before we talk about the now, I want to talk about a couple of wines that are very special to Chappellet. I wish I had a 69 Cabernet in front of me, but I don't. Not a lot of people can say. Are you going to pick one up right now? Oh, that's so cool, man.
It's the last one that I actually had.
Oh, wow.
Is that facing backwards?
No, it's actually reading.
Not,
Yeah, it's reading.
it's a 69, I promise.
And also, now I have in front of me the Chenin Blanc. So a couple of things. Talk to me about the 69 Cabernet has been described as a timeless wine. When I think of 91 Dominus, when I think of 73 Chateau Montelena Chardonnay, when I think of the 92 Screaming Eagle that sold for $500,000 at auction, I also think of 69 Chappellet Cabernet. And also too, with this bottle, with this Chenin Blanc, it reminds me of the winery, very cathedral. And so I love that. So talk a little bit about both of these wines. And also, if you want to like talk about Pritchard Hill in general, just like how special it is to make wines in that place and how your wines are so distinct because of that terroir.
Okay. Let's see what comes out. So I guess I'll start with the 1969. It was our first commercial vintage. We did make a 1968, but it didn't have a vintage designated on it. So it just said, it just didn't have a year on there. And I think the reason that I've heard is that we didn't actually make it here because we didn't have a winery that was finished.
Mm-hmm.
And so since it was made in another winery or a couple other wineries, we weren't able to give it a vintage. That was part of the statute back then. That obviously isn't the case now because a lot of people are making wines at other people's wineries and they can put vintages on them. So I think it was just an antiquated thing. Anyway, that was the 68. 69 came along. And as far as everything goes, it wasn't like it was some perfect vintage. It's not like we've got the winemaker now. It's not like everything went perfect in the tank. It was one of our first vintages. We were learning how to do it. But somehow, some sort of magic crept into that bottle and everything came together. The stars aligned, the sky opened up, the rainbows started shooting out. And I don't think they knew that right away. They just said, I think this is going to be a good vintage. And in the next few years, oh yeah, this is the type of wine we want to make. That's for certain. It wasn't till 10, 12, 15 years later, I think that people started recognizing that this was really special. And then 20, 30 years come along, and people are like, oh my God, have you tried that wine? And they're like, no, how are you supposed to try it? So there isn't any. But every once in a while, a bottle would pop up here and there. We knew it was something special, but then people started recognizing it as something like magical. And then we would try it every once in a while. I was like, oh yeah, oh, wow. Okay, this is a 40-year-old wine and it tastes like maybe a 20-year-old wine at its
Yeah.
peak. What's going on? And every time we would try it, it was doing that to us like, huh, it's better than it should be.
Yeah.
Crazy, strange, weird, better than it should be. And again, it got recognized by a lot of people. And today it is very much a unicorn wine out there. It's like those other wines you've talked about, or I'll even go so far as to say that it in my mind, it sits there with those other wines I talked about, whether it's
Absolutely.
a 70 Latour or a 61 Latour or 45 Mouton or 55 Lafon, whatever.
Yeah.
You know, throughout the great years and the great names,
55 DRC.
we sit right there with that, which is so absolutely phenomenal. That first vintage would have done exactly the thing that my dad set all of his hopes and dreams on, creating a wine that could be talked about and displayed and put next to side by side with the great wines of the world and have it in that same realm. That's pretty phenomenal. And then skipping forward to today, that wine has set the bar for us, right? So if that's a unicorn wine and people around the world recognize this, that you just want to do that every year.
Yeah.
Yeah, you don't get to do that every year.
That's
Whatever,
no.
there's so many variables in what we do. First of all, because we're farmers, we don't know what we're going to get from the world on any given year. So we try to set us to be successful. But the variables are uncountable, insurmountable, sometimes not understood. And there's always a bit of, I hate to be cheesy, but there's a bit of magic in every year that's going to make it different. There's a bit of the unknown that creeps into every bottle that gives it the opportunity to be something special, hopefully, but also makes every vintage unique. It's what we love about wine, right? There's a surprise every time you open a bottle. It's like, oh, is this going to be great? And sometimes there's bottle variation. One bottle might be a little better than another. So that 69 encompasses all of that for us. And it also sets the bar for us to say, okay, we did it that time. Which one of our vintages over these last 56 years is going to sit there in that same pocket with the 69? Will be talked about again in 40 years from now or whatever as another one of those. Hopefully there's one or two that time.
I think
Now
so. Yeah.
I've gotten a chance to taste through just about every vintage we've ever made, actually. But I got a chance in 2018 to do that all in 2 sittings with a group of other people who had won an auction lot. And it was pretty phenomenal to be able to taste a consistency, a through line of this place, of the wines that we make through time.
Mhm.
The other cool thing about that specific tasting was that we invited all of the winemakers who had been part of making those wines over the years to come
Oh,
and
that's
taste.
cool.
So listening to them talk to each other about, oh yeah, remember that I started this wine, but you finished it, you bottled it. Oh, remember that one went through. Uh, we actually had to recall those bottles because they were going through malolactic in the bottle, and they were just excited about talking about their craft and the overlap between them and the different vintages. And so fun again to be able to be in that room to listen. So that was Joe Cafaru, Tony Soder,
Mhm.
Kath Morrison, and Philip Titus. The one who didn't show up was Philip Tonier, who made the 69. We invited him, but he didn't come to the tasting. It's a phenomenal product that we get to be part of because it has the opportunity to be magical, to
Yeah.
transcend. And then moving into the Shannon, if you want to put that bottle up again for a second,
Yeah.
I have to give my mom credit for this new version of the Shannon. It says Molly Chappellet. It's hard to read here, but it says Chappellet, and then in gold under there, it just says Molly Chappellet. That's the label. I
Yeah.
don't know what's to turn it around for, uh, to know that it's Chenin Blanc.
Yeah.
But ultimately, when they first bought the property, there was 25 acres of Chenin Blanc that had been planted. They were on the highest terraces. My dad didn't come here to make Chenin Blanc. He came to make Cabernet, basically, or
Yeah.
Bordeaux varieties. The Chenin was just, it was there because the guy who planted the vineyards knew that there was a lot of Chenin planted in California at the time. They probably thought that'll sell. So we didn't want to just rip out vineyards and started making it. We made it in a dry style, which, at that time, Chenin Blanc in the United States was not good wine.
Yeah.
It was all being put into jugs, big gallon
Yeah.
jugs, and sold as white table wine, I literally would say white Chablis, whatever it was. And it was sweet and cloying and nasty. But people loved Chenin as far as those bulk winemakers because it just pushes out a lot of fruit. So you can make a lot of fruit from fewer acres, a lot of wine from fewer acres, but they didn't give it any reverence.
Mhm.
Luckily, our first winemakers can be a really beautiful variety. And actually those grapes up there, they've been dry farmed. The berries are really small. They're probably really pretty intense and flavorful. Let's see if we can make something with some restraint, some class, some style.
Right.
And that's where the original Chenin came about. 40 or so years into it, or even more, those old vines really started giving up the ghost. And we realized that they weren't going to last anymore. And we eked them out as long as we could. And so they all got ripped out and replanted to Cabernet and
Mhm.
Malbec, everything that should have been there in the first place. And we thought that was the end of the Chenin. It's like, it's been a good run. Thank you very much. We're out. My mom had other ideas. And she went down to the winery one day and said, Philip, talking to the winemaker, I'm a little confused. I don't know, where's our new Chenin being planted? And he's, let's find a place.
Don't say
Uh,
anything, just find it.
yeah. He and our vineyard manager got together and we had just ripped out an area that needed to be replanted right by the winery. So now we've got 3.5 acres of Chenin Blanc. We are hugely proud of it. It's got almost a cult following out there in the wine world.
Oh, yeah, for sure.
Restaurateurs and somms love it. These days we use it as a carrot. Like, we'll give you a little if you continue to support us on these other wines or whatever. Or if we really like you, we'll give you a little of it, but we don't have much around. We've only got those 3.5 acres as opposed to, again, the 25 plus acres that we had early on.
Yeah.
So from a wine that we didn't plan or think that we would ever make to a wine that we had all of our hopes and plans set on, those two seem to have bookended who we are at Chappellet in many ways. We're known for Cabernet, but we've got this really special Chenin that, why is it special? Why is it so good?
Yeah.
And I think we treat it well and respect it. And maybe that's part of the reason. And then the bottle and the design, that was all my mom. My mom said, I like the shape of that bottle. I like the look of that design. I don't care if it's a Riesling bottle. It's what our Chenin's going into, and it's going to be lovely and you'll love it. Just be quiet. So,
That's so cool, man. I love your mom. When you think about Pritchard Hill, talk a little bit about the terroir in Pritchard Hill. What makes it so special? I don't think people really truly understand. People hear people talk about Pritchard Hill, and there's this hype around it. But there's a
yeah.
specific reason why those wines are so good, and how do you think that place reflects itself in your wines?
Just the variables I spoke about, they're too numerous to mention, but
Yeah.
I'll throw in some things that I think are important up here. First of all, we've got, because of the multitude of slopes that we've got, the different elevations, we've got the different depth of soils, we've got a lot of variety up here, but all focused in one spot. Obviously, the altitude is going to make a difference in where we are. One of the things that it's done that I don't think we counted on was that it has provided this sort of amazing barrier to the hot years and the cold years. And the reason I say that is, up on the hill here, we get exposed to sunlight earlier in the day than the valley, oftentimes during the growing season, because the valley will be locked in fog and will be getting sun earlier than the rest of the valley. The other thing is that we cool down in the summer. When it's hot, we cool down in the evenings more than the valley floor does.
Right.
So there's this mid-range. We get longer daylight hours, but we're not as hot as the valley floor. And on those cool years, because we get longer daylight hours, we're more consistent. And it just has to do with this little band of where we are up in the valley as far as altitude. We couldn't have planned or counted on that, but it saved us year after year. In the years that are more extreme one way or another, um, we've, we've lucked out because of where we are. There's two major soil types up here, Sobrante loam and Hembrite rock outcrop. Again, that also leads to the diversity up here. We've got 45 different blocks up on the 100+ acres that we've got that are anywhere from 2 to 5 acre blocks. And all of that lends to a patchwork of opportunity every year. So we can take the best out of every year, which may be a little different than the best from the year before because of the different conditions that the year gave us. If it was a really dry year, maybe there's areas in the vineyard that stay a little more moist that are going to be doing a little better, and vice versa. On a wet years, or a cool year, there's areas of the vineyard that get a lot more sun than others, and those are going to shine because of the diversity within our Cabernet. It has allowed us to really blend to quality every year based on what that year has given us.
Right.
The tons of rocks up here on Pritchard Hill, they are our nemesis, and they're also what makes this place special.
Right.
My mom looks at those rocks and she sees beauty and shape and form and nature, and it's something to be respected and elevated to greatness. The vineyard crew sees them every time they're fixing something on their tractor that just broke because it hit a rock.
As a thorn.
But the rocks and Pritchard Hill are synonymous. We knew that was the case early on. We were told we shouldn't farm up here because of too many rocks.
Yeah.
It was too difficult. But the first vineyards to go in up here were ours. Except for Charles Pritchard's back in the 1860s. He did have some vineyards up here in the 1860s. But
First settler to Pritchard Hill.
Yeah. But since then, we were the first ones to get vineyards back up here again. And then at some point, obviously people started recognizing that this was a special spot because we started getting people buying up land around us, planting new and we have such an incredible group of wineries up here around us, making some of the best wine in Napa Valley, really.
Absolutely.
We can name them off, and they're all crowding around us. We've got Bryant shares a property line with us. Continuum shares a property line with us. Ovid is right there. Brand, Gandona, Nine Sons.
I was actually going to say 9 Sons,
which is now Realm. They're all right here, crowding around, trying to get a piece of this place that is so special. And for those who don't know, Pritchard Hill, you mentioned it before, Pritchard Hill is Chappellet. That's how we think of it.
Absolutely.
And in many ways, that's very true because my dad had the foresight to realize that this was a special place and that name Pritchard is synonymous with the property. And he thought maybe I should trademark that name. What I believe that has done for us is allow us to preserve a place in a way that an AVA, at least the way that they're structured right now, cannot. So that's why if you're looking at Napa Valley and you find us on Pritchard Hill and you're looking at an AVA map of Napa Valley, you'll see we are not in a specific sub-AVA. We're just in the middle of this open, unaviated spot. And it's more about our saying, yeah, but this place is special. If we designate an AVA and say, yeah, we'd like to be part of the AVA structure in Napa Valley and have it named Pritchard Hill, that whole section of open land that is not named could ostensibly be called Pritchard Hill. And then Pritchard Hill wouldn't be Pritchard Hill anymore. If that makes sense. It would encompass that lake that you see off in the distance. It would encompass lower lands, different aspects. And so for us, we talked when our neighbors want to use the name Pritchard Hill, we say, absolutely, there's ways that you can use that. You don't get to call one of your wines Pritchard Hill. There's other ways that we don't want you to use it, but ultimately we want you to promote this area because we think it's special. All of those neighbors I mentioned, they can all say, yes, we grow grapes up here on Pritchard Hill. We have a winery on Pritchard Hill. We make wines with Pritchard Hill fruit, however they want to describe it in that way, using that name. Like I said, except for some restrictions that we have on, is a way for us to protect a special place more than, because I've gotten into some pretty heated arguments about, well, why aren't you guys an AVA? This is ridiculous. You're just holding on to that name for no reason. That's not really the case. It's really about preserving something we think is special. And there very well may be an AVA that encompasses us one day, but it won't be called Pritchard Hill because we want to keep it specially defined as this area specific.
Dominic, I'm glad you mentioned that because I already had that in my notes, but it is true. It's crazy. Like a lot of people get so fed up. And would it be safe to say, like, when I hear you say that in my mind, it reminds me of when your father's company went public and how everything changed. And I almost feel like taking the Pritchard Hill and making it an AVA, it's like going public. And you don't want things to change. You want to preserve this place. And I'm glad that you mentioned all the things about how that, when I told you in the beginning of this podcast, you are Pritchard Hill, I was alluding to all the things you just said. So I'm glad you mentioned that.
Every once in a while, I get maybe a little flippant about it. I've turned off a couple people here and there. We did a trade nut lunch not too long ago. And one of the guys who showed up, he said, oh yeah, I've been up to Pritchard Hill lots of times. I've been up to Colgan. I've been up to Continuum, and I met Don Bryant years ago. And he goes, yeah, that place is great. And I said, oh, so you haven't been to Pritchard Hill? Sorry. I was just get a little flippant.
You know what? Let me just tell you though, for those that are listening, when you own 640 acres or so worth of land, you can say that. And that's Chappellet.
Yeah. Unfortunately, I don't think he bought any wine that day, but, or he may never buy but I don't know. Tried to undercut him in front of his friends, but I had to say something.
Yeah, I hear you. So I'm going to talk really briefly about your impact on the environment and what Chappellet does to make an impact and be environmentally conscious. So there's three things. In 2008, you created a solar project. You have around 960 solar modules, individual solar modules on the property. This is 20,000 square feet worth of solar power. You're reducing greenhouse gases, which is huge. You also created a state-of-the-art water processing system. This was in 2011. You can actually return that water back to vineyard irrigation, which is super cool. So between the energy and between the water, and also in 2012, you went all organic. So I think that like around, as far as your planted vineyard, your planted acres to vineyard are concerned, you went 100% organic. So between the solar power, between the irrigation and just being organic, this is huge for being environmentally conscious. So I feel like just like you are Pritchard Hill, you are also a representative or a spokesperson for doing the right thing in terms of the environment and making it an impact the way that you do. So if you want to just share really briefly about those three achievements, if you will, and what they mean to you.
I think it goes back again to something I said earlier. It goes beyond the vineyards and the winery, right? We are on an incredible piece of property. We are the stewards of that whole piece of property, all 640 acres, and not just the vineyards. Now, the vineyards and the wine, they make it possible for us to be stewards of this place. There's no doubt. But we live here, care about this place. We don't want harsh chemicals going into our water that we're drinking. We don't want to do the wrong thing by this place. One of the really cool things that I think about that I am proud of up here is that, okay, we've been farming here for 56 years, let's say.
Yeah.
Somewhere in that range. And during that time, we can test our soils now and know that they're actually in better shape than they were when we started farming this piece of property. That's pretty cool. If we were to leave today and we were to let all the vineyards die off and just let this land go fallow, it would be better off for our having been here. That's pretty amazing.
Yeah.
So I feel really good about that. As far as the solar panel project, it seemed like the right thing to do at the time, and it still is now. We can offset all of our power usage was solar. That was clear. Water has, it's huge. We don't have a farming operation without water.
Yeah.
So we're always looking at ways to save it. Early on, my father was smart enough to realize that we were going to need water to irrigate, and was able to put in a couple irrigation dams in a runoff area so we can use that. But saving over 1 million gallons a year by recycling the water that we use in the winery, and that water is coming from wells. That's not coming from our irrigation ponds. That's the stuff that we drink, right? It
Yeah.
goes to cleaning out the tanks and the barrels and the floors, but it all just goes in the drain. We decided that we save that. So it gets processed, again, goes back into another holding reservoir, and that can be put back onto the vines. Um, and then organic farming, again, quality was number one. How do we make the best wine? We need the best grapes, the best methods to make that happen. There was not a big organic farming push in the 70s when our vineyard manager was going to school at Davis and Fresno. He didn't learn how to farm organically.
Yeah.
So we came up, and actually the reason it came about as far as full on getting certified organic. Now, a couple of things, let me just throw in here. I believe we were, it seems like a big thing to say, but I think we were the first ones to do cover crops in the Napa Valley.
Yeah. I was going to mention that too.
We did it for the reason of keeping the soils up here on the hill. We felt like we needed to get some grasses in there so that when winter came, all the water wasn't pushing the soils off down into Lake Hennessy down there. We knew we had a limited amount of soil. We needed to keep it. So we planted grasses just for slope stabilization and to keep soil up on the hill. That got more and more extensive as to what we were planting and why we were planting it. We started planting legumes from time to time, clover. Those things were about replenishing the soil, and then eventually started planting things that would encourage the right insects and allow for a place for the insects to live other than on the vines. All those things came into play. But the reason we went fully organic came about because of an issue that happened in the Napa Valley with a resurgence of phylloxera. The AXR rootstock got developed, I think, at Davis, and it was the greatest thing since sliced bread. Everybody in the valley had to go to this because it was drought resistant. It produced more fruit. It was easier on the vine. So people started switching over to this AXR rootstock. But what they didn't know was that it wouldn't hold up to phylloxera in the soil. It was not immune like the other grapevines rootstocks were because there was a new strain. It ended up wiping out hundreds, if not thousands of acres of vines over the course of its run in the Napa Valley. And we had planted one section of our vineyard to this AXR. And sure enough, a few years after, people in the Napa Valley were realizing that they had phylloxera when we were ripping out their vines, we started showing signs that we had the phylloxera up there. In order to combat it, we had heard that there was a guy, a local guy, who was an organic farmer who might be able to help us out. This guy's name was Amigo Bob, and big dreadlocks, straw hat, shorts, flip-flops, just like you might imagine.
Yeah.
But great guy and really knew his stuff. And we said, we've got phylloxera in here. Is there anything you can do to help us? And he said, I can't get rid of phylloxera, but I'm pretty sure I can make your vines so healthy that they won't care it's there. And so we got a place to experiment. And we experimented with his methods. We made compost tea. We did all these things. They're all fully organic methods to strengthen these vines. And sure enough, over the course of the next year and the next year and the next year, this vineyard couldn't have cared less that there was phylloxera in the soil and actually produced beautiful fruit. We ended up ripping it out for other reasons beyond phylloxera. It had just run its life, but it made us rethink our vineyard practices in general. And so we started incorporating more organic methods in there. And it took about 10 or 12 years for us to really fully embrace it. And then we finally got certified 100% organic in 2012. And that's the story, but it's a lot more work, a lot more handwork, but again, produces the best quality grapes for us, does the right thing by this property, allows us to be the good stewards of this place that we hope to be. And again, it just seemed like the right thing to do. And it seems to have been paying off for us.
And Dominic, I also wanted to mention just for the listeners, I didn't mention this, but it's not like you decided in 2012 to be organic. Like you've been practicing organic
Like,
farming since the early 80s.
yeah.
So this is a CCOF certification. This just makes you like official. So I want to make sure that people know you guys have been very much focused on this intent for several decades. And with that being said, Dominic, how can people find you? How can people learn more about you? I'd be shocked if there's somebody listening that is like, oh, who's Chappellet? But how can they find you and learn more about you?
The easiest way these days, we've got an Instagram, we've got a Facebook channel. We're not on every social media platform, but those two are pretty solid for us.
Yeah.
Every once in a while, I think that we've got an old TikTok account, and I don't know if anybody's posting to that. Uh, and so that's Chappellet Winery. You search that out on either Facebook or Instagram. You'll get daily stuff going up on there. And then, of course, we have a website, which I know is passe these days. We still have one, and we need
Yeah.
it to sell some wine. But that's a great resource for the people who want to learn a little bit about us and certainly see our wines and maybe learn a little bit more through research that way. Those are the easy ones. But the best way to find out about us is to give us a call at the winery, come up and see us. I've been talking about it now this whole time. It is a very special place. If that hasn't come across from me in this, I've not been doing my job. I certainly feel it down to my toes that this place is unique and we love sharing it with people. Again, the best thing to do is come up and visit. And I hope to see you up here soon, Michael.
Oh, Dominic, I would be truly honored. I can't explain to you how much this time means to me. And with all those like social media website, all those links that you mentioned, they will be linked in the show notes so that for the people that are listening right now, they can just
Okay.
jump on and click those links and it'll take them right to whatever they want to search. But my final question today goes back to how I started the podcast and we were talking about your father. And your father passed away in 2016. And you mentioned how he was such a soft spoken man, which I was aware of that. And for those that are listening, he was a giant. So if you think about the 6'4" guy, soft spoken man, but when you think about the legacy and everything that him and your mother created and everything, you're second generation. So we're looking at a second generation who's totally involved in this legacy, the way that your father and mother created this brand. Was there ever a time though where before your father passed, where you and your father were in a moment where you were just sitting around, you were looking maybe at the vineyards or you were looking at the winery, you were in this special kind of like father-son bonding, and you looked at your father or your father looked at you and you were just sharing in the joy of what started out back in the day in the late 60s. We talk about entrepreneurial risk taking. This was like the shovel in the ground, break the ground, and let's just, I hate to say roll the dice. I don't think it was much about roll the dice of uncertainty. I think it was more roll the dice of which way are we going to go. But was there ever a time where your father and you shared in a special moment that you would be willing to share? Or something that he said to you that he felt like, man, this is way more than I could have ever imagined. And it was just a moment that you'll never forget and you'd be willing to share.
Yeah, there are a number of those. I'll share two. One has nothing to do with wine, but to me, it encompasses my dad and this place. When he was during the last year of his life, and we're talking, and I'm asking him questions about his life, and we're just having a nice conversation. And at one point, asked him, "Dad, what's your greatest memory being up here? What is it that you would take away from here as being your fondest memory of what encapsulates your life up here?" And he said, "My pet squirrel." He loved animals. He loved this place. He found an injured squirrel on the side of the road one day coming home. I remember that day. I was a little kid and put it in his pocket, nursed it back to health, and raised a squirrel in the house that drove my mom crazy because it lived in their bathroom and chewed up all their towel racks. But he was such a kind and gentle soul, this big guy nursing this tiny little baby squirrel with an eyedropper. And then as it grew up, he had to eventually let it out of the house. And he took it down to a big oak tree on our property, not too far from the house. And every afternoon when he'd come back home from work, he'd go down the oak tree, he'd call this squirrel, give it a little whistle, and it would come running down from the tree, run around him. And get on his shoulder, dive into his pocket, get some nuts. So that, while it's silly in many ways, that encapsulates what the ultimate expression of this place. We were a part of this place. We were encouraging growth and helping each other out, and the land was helping us, and we were helping the land. And that little moment in time with my dad and this squirrel that he got to raise, that was the most impactful moment for him, having created his dream, moved his family to the Napa Valley, bet everything on this thing. When it came down to him, were these moments that connected him with this place, and that was
Yeah.
the ultimate expression of that. So again, maybe that's silly, but that's what I think of. And then the wine moment that we had, again, this is not about being braggadocious. It's about us sharing a special moment with my dad. And as I remember this, it was just he and I. It was in the late afternoon, maybe 5 o'clock, something like that. And he had decided, for whatever reason, he had gone into his cellar and decided there was a bottle of wine in there that he hadn't tried for a long time, and wanted to see if it was still good. And I was there at the house. I was about 18. And he said, I think this might be interesting for you to try. And he told me a little bit about the wine. And he said, just know that this wine that I poured you, there's probably no price that can be paid for it. Take your time with it. And it was 1929 Margaux that he had collected, which is one of those unicorn wines,
Yeah.
like we talked about. And we spent whatever it is, 45 minutes or so, sitting together in one of the rooms at their house, talking about this wine, and just being there together and seeing his love of this process, of this wine that was sharing with me. Now, it was a very old wine when I was 18, that 29 Margaux,
Yeah.
but it was a very special moment that he and I got to share together with something that he felt was really special. And it was a wine that was well past its prime, but still ethereal and beautiful. And everything that it had been was like an echo. It was there. You knew it was still in there, but there was nothing wrong with it. It was just old. It was past its time, but everything that it held was still in that bottle. And I got to share that with my dad. So those are two things that I think of that were special things that we got to share. I
You're
also raised a squirrel years after that. So.
The funny thing about the pet squirrel story is it reminds me of the Seinfeld. I think they hit a squirrel in the city, and then they tried to take it to the vet, and the vet's, you got to raise the squirrel. I don't know what you want to do. And so then George was
I haven't
mad
seen it.
because he was stuck with the squirrel. But it reminded me of that. Dominic, when I hear you talk about your father, there's so much more than just entrepreneurship. There's so much more than like risk taking. There's a man we talk about soft spoken, but he has a heart of gold, and he had a heart of gold, and everything that he did and the legacy that he created, especially for the second generation, now the entire family. It's so cool to think about all the Chappellet names that are involved in the winery, and you're still a family owned winery, which is hard to come by today. When I think about the third generation, like what is the third generation going to be doing? And there's so many things that run through my head about the next generation of Chappellet. But to have this time with you today, Dominic, it I can't put it into words, because it's, when I think about you and we think about Chappellet and we think about how Chappellet is Pritchard Hill, I said this in the beginning of the interview, you are not just Pritchard Hill, you are the wine industry. You are very much the representation of what it means to leave everything, put all the hard work, all the commitment into something, and to have the results and to have all of the things to show for. And so to hear you talk about your father and to hear you talk about your mother, Molly, and how she's just, I feel like she's just like firecracker. Like she's going to crack the whip. She's going to do whatever she's got to do. And 93, to be so beautifully young and to be continuing to have that energy and that vibrance, and thinking about your family and your kids, and just hearing about the property, all the things that you've talked about, I can't figure out a way to sum it up other than I want to tell you just how much it means to have this time. We did go over today, but it means so much to me. And you're somebody that I look up to. You're a true representation of not just wine and family, but of business and communion and bringing so many people together. And so, Dominic, as humbly as I can let you know, I truly appreciate your time. I look up to you. And thank you so much today for sharing the story of Chappellet, the story of wine, if you will. on the Mr. Wine Guy podcast.
Michael, thank you so much. You were very kind to me and you didn't throw me the hardball questions. So I appreciate it. And maybe there'll be another opportunity for us to do another one of these in the future. But if not, at the very least, come see us while I'm up here so I can show you around the place.